All right, grab your seats. Consider this your absolute first day of law school. Welcome, my 1L students, to this masterclass explainer on the foundational legal framework that actually governs personal data here in the US. Today, we're putting on our legal caps to figure out exactly how the rules that dictate our digital lives work, both on paper and in the real world.
So let's just jump right in with a scenario. I want you to really think about this. If your data is breached today, like right this second, who actually steps in to protect you? Is it the local cops? Is it some federal agency? Or do you have to just go out and sue them yourself? Hooking into the real-world stakes here is absolutely crucial, because the answer is honestly not that simple. It depends entirely on this incredibly complex, overlapping web of rules, and that is exactly what we're going to untangle today. Here's the syllabus for today's explainer. We're going to start with the branches of privacy law, decode preemption and consent, and tackle the whole opt-in versus opt-out debate. Then, we'll wrap things up by looking at enforcement via consent decrees and comparing California versus federal standards.
Okay, moving right along to Section 1, the branches of privacy law, the legal machinery. Let's see how the Constitution sets up the gears for privacy enforcement. Look at how the US government breaks down here. It's basically like a giant machine with 3 distinct gears, right? You got the legislative branch, Congress, and they draft the privacy blueprint by actually making the laws. Then the executive branch, the president and agencies like the FTC, they act as the police force enforcing those laws. And finally, the judicial branch, the federal courts, steps in to interpret the laws and make sure they actually align with the Constitution. Each gear essentially checks and balances the other, so no single entity has total control over your privacy rights.
But, and this is where it gets kind of wild, while those 3 branches are separate, Congress often delegates specific authority to federal agencies, like the Federal Trade Commission, the FTC. This is fascinating because it means an agency can actually wield power that's characteristic of all 3 branches. They promulgate rules, which is legislative. They investigate and enforce violations, which is executive. And they even settle disputes, which is judicial. So when we're talking about privacy enforcement in the US, these agencies are just massively powerful players.
All right, Section 2, decoding preemption and consent overlapping laws. Let's look at how we resolve competing state and national rules.
So, because lawmaking power in the US is shared between the national government and the states, you've got to wonder, what happens when state and federal privacy laws just totally collide? Like if California says one thing and Washington, D.C. says another, who actually wins?
Well, the answer is a little concept called preemption. Basically, preemption is a superior government's ability to have its laws completely supersede those of an inferior government. Under the U.S. Constitution, federal law is the supreme law of the land, which means in certain situations, a federal privacy law will completely override or preempt any state laws that are trying to regulate the exact same thing. Let's make this concrete. Take the Federal Can-Spam Act, which regulates commercial emails and marketing. To make sure businesses didn't have to navigate 50 completely different sets of rules just to, send out a weekly newsletter, the federal government used preemption. That means states are legally blocked from imposing any stricter obligations on email senders than what the federal law already dictates. The federal rule basically acts as both the floor and the ceiling. Now on to Section 3, opt-in versus opt-out, consumer choice. We've talked a lot about the government. Let's talk about you. When an organization wants to use your data, U.S. law almost always circles back to this one idea, choice. But notice the massive difference between these 2 approaches. Opt-in requires an affirmative express act. They ask, may we share your information? And you literally have to say yes. If you do nothing, your data stays private. Opt-out is the exact opposite. It's an implied choice based entirely on your failure to object. They say, unless you tell us not to, we're going to share your data. In that case, if you do nothing, your data gets shared. The practical difference between actually taking action versus giving implied consent through inaction is just huge, and it's heavily debated in privacy circles right now. Which leads us to this core legal philosophy regarding consumer consent. Choice is not always appropriate, but if it is offered, it should be meaningful. Meaningful choice means you actually have a real crystal clear understanding of the implications of what you're deciding. Tricking a user with super confusing legal jargon just to get them to opt in or hoping they fail to opt out, that completely violates the very spirit of the law. Moving to Section 4, enforcement via consent decrees, enforcing privacy. What actually happens when a company breaks a privacy promise? We all picture this dramatic law and order courtroom trial for every privacy violation, but the reality is way more pragmatic. Enter the consent decree. This is essentially a judgment entered by consent of the parties where the defendant agrees to just stop the alleged illegal activity. And the kicker? They typically do it without admitting any guilt or wrongdoing. It gets formalized by a judge and boom, it carries the total legal weight of a court decision.
So the FTC uses these all the time, especially for violations of laws like CIPP, the Children's Online Privacy Protection Act. Under these decrees, the violators usually have to stop the bad practice immediately, pay some pretty massive fines to the government, and agree to strict monitoring going forward. And again, they do all of this without ever having to publicly admit they were in the wrong. It is an incredibly powerful, efficient tool that forces compliance without dragging out a trial for years on end.
And that brings us to the final lesson on our syllabus, Section 5, California versus Federal Standards, Breach Standards. Let's look at a concrete case study on data breaches.
All right, as your law professor for the day, I'm giving you the master key for deconstructing any new statute you ever encounter. When you read a privacy law, always look for these 4 things. 1, who is covered? 2, what types of information are actually covered? 3, what exactly is required or prohibited? And 4, who enforces the law?
Let's test that framework on California SB 1386, which was the first major security breach notification law. Who's covered? Any entity doing business in California with computerized data. What's covered? Unencrypted personal info of California residents. What's required? The expedient disclosure of any security breach. And who enforces it? This is the big one. Both the California Attorney General and individuals through a private right of action. That last part is a real game changer because it gives everyday consumers the direct power to sue if a company fails to notify them of a breach. So California goes hard, right? Setting this incredibly aggressive standard. But because other states have enacted their own varying breach laws, companies are stuck navigating this chaotic patchwork of 50 completely different state requirements. And this brings us right back to our lesson on preemption. The federal government has been heavily debating stepping in with a single, preemptive, federal-based law just to standardize breach notifications nationwide. It is this constant tug of war between having really strict state protections versus standardized federal efficiency. To wrap up our masterclass today, I want to leave you with a completely fascinating and honestly pretty surprising fact. Despite everything we've just talked about regarding the protection of our personal data, the U.S. Constitution does not actually contain the word privacy anywhere in its text. No way, right? Instead, constitutional privacy rights come from what the Supreme Court calls a penumbra, basically a shadow of unenumerated rights that they've interpreted from other amendments, like the Fourth Amendment's protection against unreasonable searches. Which leaves us with a stark, provocative question to end on. We've seen that these fundamental rights rely on judicial interpretations of this penumbra. And, as legal scholars observed during the 2022 Dobbs decision, Supreme Court interpretations of these unenumerated rights can profoundly shift. So, if the very foundation of constitutional privacy is based on evolving interpretations, how secure are our digital rights really going to be tomorrow? It's definitely something every privacy professional, and honestly, every single one of us needs to be watching very closely. Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer. Class dismissed.